Hello and welcome to the first Byline Book Club. I'm Hardeep Matharu, I'm the editor of Byline Times, and if you didn't already know, Byline also has a publishing house. And today we'll be joined by our first published author, Kyle Taylor, who'll be telling us about his book, The Little Black Book of Data and Democracy. So over the next hour, I'll be having a discussion with Kyle, looking at the genesis of the book and some of the most concerning issues to emerge from it. And then we'll be having a Q&A with your questions. So if there is anything that comes to mind, do just jot it down on YouTube as we go along, and we'll come to those a bit later. Kyle, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Kyle, so I should introduce you, first of all, as our author tonight. You are an expert in political campaigning. You're an expert in how data and the digital world is reshaping democracy and elections. You're director of the Fair Vote project. So you're pretty well qualified to be writing what I would say is a book of our times, really. And certainly when I read it, I loved it because it was so accessible. I could understand everything. I'm not a techie person. And it was memorable and it was shocking. You know, the degree to which big tech and big data has the amount of power it has essentially over our lives, and how that is going to continue, and sort of how we're getting a raw deal essentially. So first of all, why don't you tell me, I mean, this is a book that's urgently needed. I mean, presumably that was the thinking behind it.
Yeah, I mean, so I've worked on every side of this, and I started as a practitioner. And when the digital world and social media emerged, I was in the club of people who were like, this is going to be great for politics, great for democracy. We can reach people directly, no more gatekeepers, all of that. But as it turns out, like anything that is left entirely to the free market and requires scale, we ended up with 5 monopolies who effectively control 90% of what we see, hear, and engage with on the internet. Whether it's Google search, 92% of Google searches in the UK, or 92% of searches in the UK start on Google, to social media, 89% of social media engagements happen on Facebook. We are living in a world where very few companies control our reality. And that's something that if you've lived in or studied authoritarian or dictatorial regimes, you'd be familiar with, because that's the first objective: control and define reality. But in democracies, this is very new. And because it's new, I mean, it's really only sort of been on steroids the last 10 years, we are in a place where we can't quite wrap our heads around what to do about it, because we've been socialized to believe our institutions are secure. Democracy will reign supreme. The rule of law will win out. And just in terms of why I've written it in such an accessible way, I really feel like what happened over the last 10 years as well is we've all been told this is all too complicated. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. And
it's all good because it'll give you lots more information and connections.
Convenient.
So it's good. And it's very complicated, and that equation is really dangerous. I mean, one of the things that the book starts with is how do we go from 180 characters, 140 characters on Twitter to, the insurrection at the Capitol, which we saw at the start of this year. I mean, that's the scale we're talking, aren't we?
Yeah, and it's very easy to dismiss this as alarmist or extremist or something, but tell me what else this significant in society has changed over the last 10 years. Nothing. This is it. I mean, this is the most significant change in human history. We're talking about doing 100 years in 10, basically, in terms of changing how we live. And the insurrection's a really important and timely one because so it's accessible so you can engage with the issues, but also it's changing so fast.
Yes.
Right, as we were going to print in February and March, I was writing up to the wire, oh my God, now there's been an attempted coup at the Capitol. I have to include this or this book won't seem relevant. And with that particular piece, it came full circle just in the last week when at NYU, a university in the US, notified Facebook that they were going to be using a tool that Facebook makes available to researchers to look at disinformation around the insurrection, because there's a congressional committee now, select committee into the insurrection, to provide them with information about how Facebook was used in the run-up to and on the day of the insurrection. Facebook restricted their access within hours.
Yeah.
So what are you hiding?
Well, that is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, again, I really liked about your book were the questions it raised. I mean, it's called The Little Black Book of Data and Democracy. And I think, like you've just touched on, we think of democracy as like a sort of nebulous concept. It's this abstract that we, in the US and America and the UK, we just live in, and sort of assume that it's just been there. It always has. It will always continue. But we don't think too much about it. And actually, we don't really think about what living in a fully democratic state actually demands of its citizens. It demands quite a lot. It demands a lot of you. Why do you think that some of the discussions that are now taking place around big tech and big data and social media companies, why do you think that element of discussing the actual effects on democracy are still, not, being missed and in a way are being highlighted in your book?
Because the people in power don't benefit from an educated, active, engaged society. Right? The goal of people in power, particularly at this moment, is to maintain power. And democracy is really inconvenient for that. Because what if you lose an election? So instead, what you want to do is shape reality in a way that your side believes entirely in the world that you've said is truth, regardless of whether it is, and restrict the ability of others to participate. It's a 1-2 punch. And it's this sort of cyclical thing that seems to happen as soon as the last generation who experienced, fascism, authoritarianism, it dies off. So, it's important to remind people that Hitler was democratically elected. And if we look at Hungary right now, Viktor Orban was democratically elected.
Yes.
That's no longer a democracy. He could not easily lose power at a poll, right? That's not how that works anymore. And we're looking at the same situation here. In the UK, we've got a government who is, restricting the right to protest. It wants to introduce voter ID, which we know disenfranchises marginalized populations, wants to eliminate judicial review, so you can't challenge their decisions in court. I mean, it's all, and the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, getting rid of it, so only the Prime Minister is empowered to call an election. And how are they facilitating this narrative? How are they building this community of people to support that worldview when none of that is actually democratic? Social media.
And it's interesting you talk about the changing of reality and people's individual realities and therefore our shared reality. And one of the things you make clear in the book is, for democracy to thrive, you need an informed citizenry who are party to a shared reality. And I think, again, one of the issues that is less discussed in terms of big tech and social media is what it's actually doing to our realities. And you describe an interesting exchange in the book as an example where you say you're talking to somebody on Twitter about the National Health Service, and you're talking about the population of the United Kingdom and the population of Pennsylvania with this person.
A single state. Yeah.
Yes, Pennsylvania is a state in America. And the person says, well, I know that the populations are the same.
Yeah, I'm having this exchange
say
about...
no.
Yeah,
and he says, but I've lived there and I feel that they are. And that exchange was fantastic because that is the issue, isn't it? It's about, I feel this reality. But why don't you tell us a bit more about how you think data in the digital world is reshaping these realities?
Well, feelings aren't facts, right? But what we have is an information system in social media that is for profit. So I call them information neutral. They don't care what information is moving through, as long as that information is keeping every individual on as long as possible. Because the longer you keep somebody on, the more ads you can sell, the more ads you can sell, the more money you can make. And at the core, these are ad businesses. I mean, the idea of calling them social media companies or platforms, they're ad businesses. Their customers are people who are buying ad space, and your eyeballs are the ad
That's
space.
their marketing in a way, that they're social media companies.
Exactly.
It's their best form of marketing themselves.
Exactly. And if you're not paying for a product, you are the product. That's just the reality. And so when you conflate the idea of feelings with facts, and you sort of message to everyone that whatever you want is fine because your objective as a company is to keep people on, you don't want any friction. You don't want someone to feel that they're wrong, they're stupid, they're anything. You want a full affirmation environment. And that's what social media delivers. And that is to detriment of democratic society, right? You know, the world is on fire, right? Climate change is destroying our ability to survive on this planet. Not 47% of the population, that is all a hoax. If we can't agree on truth, we can't tackle the problem in a democracy. And that's the fundamental problem. If we can't get back to a place where we can agree that the sky is blue, the grass is green, how are we going to deal with the existential threats that are facing us as a species? We can't. But there's no incentive with social media companies to do that.
To address that, exactly.
Because they don't care. They want to make money. And I don't say that flippantly. I say that that's just the basics of free market economics. They're a private company, and they're beholden to shareholders to make as much money as possible. And it's about accepting, like we do in this country with the NHS, that sometimes making as much money as possible, maximizing profit, isn't the best idea, right? And you can look at how the NHS works here versus how private healthcare in America works. Of course they want you to see more doctors. Of course they want to prescribe you more medicine or suggest that you need another surgery, because every single one is just dollar signs flashing up. The NHS is like, we need to deliver health outcomes, regardless of the cost. And yet we see that the NHS runs 3 times as efficient as the US system. So it's not like you couldn't have an internet that was good for society. It's simply that the current model is a total failure.
And when we talk about, obviously, the climate emergency and how social media is essentially getting in the way of, us tackling that as a society, as a world. When we look at during the coronavirus crisis, but also beyond that, conspiracy theories, have come to great prominence in the last few years, not just the QAnon sort of movement, which posits that Donald Trump is sort of trying to save the world.
The second coming of Christ.
The second coming, and saving the world from sort of cannibals and pedophiles associated with the Democrat Party. But also people just believing, that vaccines are poison and masks are this big conspiracy around someone's freedom and the government. What is the digital world doing to the hardwiring of the human brain, if that's not too big a question to put to you? No,
I mean it's rewiring how we absorb information. And so from 1997 to 2007, which was the last year I could find useful, sort of reputable statistics on it, we went from seeing on average 500 advertisements a day to 5,000 advertisements a day. The scale of information that we are now consuming means that our brains don't have time to think through everything. And I like to visualize it as like a whole bunch of filing cabinets, right? And you get information, and what your brain's trying to do is figure out what filing cabinet it goes in. And if there's friction or disagreement, then your brain has to have a conversation with itself. That's called thinking. And you think about, okay, I have this information, I got this new information, what do I believe, what do I think is right, what do I think is wrong? But where we are now is the scale of information means our brain is trying to fast track that process. So, everyone would be familiar with the idea of cognitive dissonance, right? Like, I think this even though I'm pretty sure it's not right. We've moved beyond that to what we call motivated reasoning, where because there's so much information and it's so hard to digest it all, we are motivated to seek out something that just affirms something so we can file it away and close that cabinet. And as a result, you stop looking for new information or to learn or change your point of view. You just look for stuff that confirms what you already believe.
Do you think people like us are guilty of that as well? I.e., people who are, well informed about all the things that you're discussing here about social media. Do you think this is just something that we're all susceptible to because of the way that social media operates.
Well, we're all susceptible to falling into information silos because that's by design. So whether you're on the political left, the political right, libertarian, whatever, that algorithm, after basically 30 things that you do on a platform, knows exactly who you are and what to give you to keep you happy, right? And so we definitely fall foul of that, not letting information in. But we've also, the other thing that's happened in the last 10 years in conjunction with this is, because this is the information system, majority parties on the right have realized that they don't need to be bound by truth anymore, because there's no check, there's no gatekeeper. And so it is factual to say that both sides are not as guilty of separating themselves from truth. But the difficulty is, if you're in the silo of a fact-based world, you have to exist in a world with people who aren't absorbing those facts. And part of being in a society is going, okay, I have to get out of my bubble and find ways to actively engage people in a way that doesn't make them feel small, stupid, uneducated, et cetera, because your first response in that moment is flight, right? I am being challenged, this is hard. I've lived on social media, nobody challenges me, that's much easier. So why would I want to be challenged? Just affirm. And that's why when we talk about information reception on social media, we talk about not deplatforming, not shutting people down, banning them, but disabling engagement, right? Everyone is, yes, in a free society you have a right to say a lot of things that perhaps you shouldn't have the right to say. But that's part of living in a free society, right? Is that some people say stuff you disagree with. There's obviously the line to do with harm and when someone else's speech hurts another. But on the baseline, if you want to say vaccines kill you, that's your right. Your right is not to then have free reach. You're not entitled to reach 70 million people with that harmful bit of information. And what we see is a failure of platforms to even consider that disengagement, that disabling engagement, because that stuff drives ad revenue.
Yeah, I mean, that's really at the heart of your thesis, isn't it? That all of this information silos, the fueling the conspiracies and division and hatred, this binary world of social media that we live in, full of loud voices and it's this or it's this, it's to the benefit of the social media companies, because that's their model.
Yeah, and
that's the real challenge, it seems, as to why they would take something that is profitable, very bad for democracy, but profitable, and think about reforming it.
Don't make harm pay. I mean, it's so straightforward, but it affects their bottom line. So why would they ever support it? So it either needs to be forced upon them in the same way that we forced rules and regulations on cigarette companies because cigarettes cause cancer, and oil companies because oil spills destroy the planet. It's a reasonable expectation to think that we, as a democratic society, will say to a company, fine, you can operate, but under these parameters, because our society has leaders that are democratically elected and accountable, have decided that this is how we want our society to work, and we don't want you to be able to impact that to this degree.
Do you see any positives emerging in terms of how we tackle some of these, either here or abroad?
We are in the moment of legislation to lead to regulation. In the UK, it's the Online Safety Bill. In Europe, it's the Digital Services Act and the Digital Marketing Act. In the US, there's a suite of 5-6 different bills that are floating around. But these are going to take years and years and years to get through. And when they're through, they're still going to be imperfect, because tech and democracy are not necessarily compatible in a timescale sense, right? Democracy is supposed to be slow and deliberative and intentional. Tech is move fast and break things. So the fear is that by the time regulation's in, they'll have moved on to the next thing. And so I think we have to maintain pressure as well on the companies and reduce their relative power in our society and stop thinking about them as these sort of angels that are different. These are just businesses trying to make money. So unfortunately, there aren't a lot of positives.
I thought I'd ask.
Yeah,
It's always good to, isn't it?
and which is why, again, for me, it was about making something accessible so that people can take action themselves, which is why the whole last section of the book is, what can you do?
Which is very democratic, I may say, Kyle. Yeah, because you're informing people
Bring it to the people.
Bring it to the people. Exactly, yeah. Gosh. Right, should we see if we have any questions?
Yes.
Let's see.
I was going to mention, the last piece I was going to mention while we pull up the questions is just, the other thing we have to remember is the architecture is addictive by design.
Yes.
So there's only so much that we can do as individuals when we're talking about addiction. And the technology is designed in a similar, the infinite scroll is designed in a similar way to slot machines, which is the idea that like one more pull and I'm gonna win big. And on social media, it's like, if I just slide up one more time, I'm gonna see the coolest picture ever. I'm sure I'm missing something. I'm sure I'm missing something. I'm sure I'm missing something.
And in the book, it's this paradoxical thing you describe where you keep spending time on it, thinking it'll make me happier. And then the longer you spend on it, the more miserable it can make someone.
Absolutely.
Then it just goes round and round.
It's an endless cycle.
But it's really interesting, isn't it? Because when we hear tech and social media in the digital world, you think of sort of what I first think of is very far from what we're discussing, which is essentially the philosophy of what it is to be a human, what drives us, as people. And I think that is a really fascinating sort of thing that we all need to get on board with, because it's so profound, really.
Well, and remembering that, ultimately we're just animals on the only planet so far that we know that can sustain us, and our one job is to make sure that we don't find a way to kill ourselves, right? Because we don't have a predator. And we can't be looking at everything, we can't be looking at progress or change as inherently good if it negatively affects our ability to survive.
Yeah.
And what this is doing in the context of information is negatively affecting our ability to survive.
Well, you've done a great job writing it, Val. At least it's here. Right, let's take some questions. So, Anist John would like your thoughts on government by WhatsApp.
I mean, so the 10-second background is basically British politics runs on WhatsApp. I mean, if you engage with MPs, you learn very quickly they're all in 50 different WhatsApp groups. The government also runs on WhatsApp, and there have been several scandals recently where when WhatsApp messages have been requested of ministers, they've suddenly had to wipe their phone or get a new one, or, So it's a perfect example of what happens when you don't codify communication types as government property. And in the US, what we saw was the Supreme Court ruled, I believe it was the Supreme Court, I think it went all the way to the Supreme Court, ruled that Donald Trump's personal Twitter account, while he was president, was public record. It belonged to society, basically. So he could not delete tweets and he could not block people. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so with WhatsApp here, it's insane. There's no other way. It's a ridiculous. It's a perfect example of power consolidation through finding loopholes. And what we used to have was everything was by email. All emails were recorded, but phone calls weren't. So you'd have government ministers and MPs relay information over the phone. Now, they just use encrypted services and delete them. It is ludicrous. They should absolutely be in the public record.
Yeah, it's almost the digital facilitation of the old boys club.
Yeah.
That's literally what WhatsApp by government in these groups is.
And what we need to remember is, government is of the people and also of our money. So the phones that they're on, we own. The salaries they're paid, we're paying them. And don't let them get away with the don't let them get away with the idea or selling us the idea that they're somehow above all of that.
Yeah.
They're not.
Yeah. Phoebe adds, she would like to know your thoughts, Kyle, on government communicating by media, which is behind a paywall, presumably leaks via the Telegraph, etc., during the coronavirus pandemic. So when breaking news or updates are released via the Telegraph, a Telegraph comment article by an MP, behind a paywall, and certainly not what you'd expect from official government communications. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the key with the Telegraph is, of course, Boris Johnson's long-standing relationship with them. I believe before he became prime minister, he was being paid £300,000 a year to write a weekly column, which is something nearly what £5,500, £6,000 per column. And so there's obviously that intimate relationship. The second is, of course, transparency. It's behind a paywall. Most people can't see it. And the people who do see it are people they want to see it, who are either already friendly to them or, primarily would already be friendly to them. And it's a real shame because I've lived in lots of countries and I wasn't born here. So I have the privilege of context. We have the BBC, one of the world's preeminent public broadcasters. Imperfect, of course, what isn't? But absolutely incredible media driven by public interest and not by profit. And so, the idea that there would be, open briefings instead of privileged briefings seems a very basic one. But once again, we're in this place where we're seeing that unless it's the law, they won't do it. And so much of democracy depends on norms.
Exactly, which is something that I might add is in the next print edition of Byline Times, which goes to press on Thursday. It leads on the last of the good chaps, which is our constitutional failings. But I had one, it's interesting, in the recent interview that Dominic Cummings did with Laura Kuenssberg of the BBC, he sort of jokingly said that Boris Johnson referred to the Daily Telegraph newspaper now still as his real boss. To what extent do you think social media like Twitter facilitates the news agenda, in that there might be a Telegraph story about a government announcement behind the paywall, but then it gets onto Twitter and political correspondence in the world of Whitehall hacks? And is there anything there that's interesting in that there's a fueling of certain sort of narratives and agendas because of the way the likes of Twitter, for example, works, which you wouldn't have seen before, where we just had newspapers and sort of websites? I
mean, I think on the first point is the Daily Telegraph's my real boss. I mean, I think we've seen that in British politics, at least to my knowledge, at least the last 40 years, where Murdoch papers, the right-wing press, are actually driving the political conversation. And we're seeing the handouts continue, right? So Leveson was never made statutory to regulate the print newspapers. There are explicit carve-outs in the online safety bill for newspapers.
For the comment sections.
For the comment sections. Their editorials already and their news is already protected, but even their comment sections will be protected. If it's an online safety bill, then we should probably say if it's harmful here, it's harmful there. But we aren't, because there is a level of, and they're all fearful of whatever front page story these newspapers might print about them, right? I mean, when we first launched at Fair Vote, according to the Telegraph, on the cover, I was a fascist. I hadn't
I didn't
realized.
See that story, Carl.
I hadn't realized it. And the way they got information about me was by befriending a friend of mine on Facebook, by saying that they were my friend trying to get in touch, blah, 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 right? So these newspapers are dominating an agenda still in a way that doesn't seem real to their relevance in society. On the Twitter question, I mean, I actually think, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think that these social media spaces are actually serving as a tool to the establishment power. Because what it's done is it's create this space where people go and feel like they've done something. And so you get in these whirlwinds, right, on Twitter, but you might be in a whirlwind that I haven't even heard of because we're in different silos on Twitter. So you'll have thought that because something has swirled on Twitter, it must have trickled up or trickled down. I might not have even known that it happened because we're in a different silo, but everyone thinks that they've done something. And I think it's giving people a false sense of impact and actually allowing for dissent to be sort of shed, if you will, by people, so they can put their phone down and think, oh, I really took the government to task by commenting on those 4 posts today or posting my super interesting, message or statement. And in reality, nothing's actually changed. You've impacted nothing.
To look at it from those people's point of view, if they're up against the current government and all the shenanigans, as to put it lightly, that have been going on in terms of our democratic processes. Could it be argued that for people who feel they don't have much power to impact, to enact change in our current system and the way things are, then actually social media is a tool which allows them, like you say, it's interesting to feel like they've done something, but I guess you're saying we need to do more.
Well, what I'm saying is, don't use the power of social media to organize and enact offline action. Don't use it as the end point.
Yes.
I signed a petition. Look, you get 100,000 people to give their emails to the government, and something will be considered for debate. So the voter ID movement, an incredibly important issue and an incredibly important campaign against disenfranchising millions and millions of people from participating, hit the threshold. We considered it. We're not having a debate. March on Westminster. March on Downing Street. The government still need to feel the real effect and power of people. And so while we're all tweeting about how something's terrible, they're just taking away our right to protest.
So it's almost sort of an easy palliative, isn't it?
Yeah, use it to organize. It can't be the last thing you do.
So let's go to another question. Rob says, in the 1930s, governments and the powerful tried to control the message and what the truth was. Is social media just being used to discredit all messages so people don't believe anything anymore?
So I think that where we've gotten to in this idea of people don't believe anything anymore is driven by the realization that this tool could be used to this means, I think, trickled up from Russia in 2014, 15, 16, ahead of the EU referendum and the US presidential election, where Russia figured out we can do this, we can sow discord very cheaply. And their end game was actually just the chaos. It was no particular agenda. And it was a tool to increase their relative power to other nation states, right? So a broken Europe is much less of a foe to Russia than a united European Union. A United States in chaos, same thing. And I think China probably thought, oh, this is actually working well for us also. Now, where did that lead? Well, it led domestic actors to realize they could do the same thing with the primary objective of distrust. Just full-on, absolute distrust in the establishment, right? The irony that, like, the anti-establishment movement is being led by an Etonian here and by a billionaire in the United States, right? Like, the idea that that's anti-establishment is sort of surreal and just not based in fact. But ultimately, what the outcome of that is simply an inability to engage with anything and a standstill of movement, forwards, sideways, backwards, any direction, and raise the question of, is there truth anymore? And if we're at the point where we're asking, is there truth anymore, it's over.
Which is, you would argue we've gotten to that point?
I think we're on the brink here. Like, I think, the UN IPCC report, I can't remember how many C's are in it, 2, I think. Might be 3.
IPCC, I think.
IPCC. Okay, we got that report coming out saying, it's already too late on climate change. And I'm sort of sitting there going, is it already too late on reality? Right? Because if we can't agree, climate change is a perfect example of, if we can't agree on truth, we can't engage with it. So dealing with social media is an enabling factor to being able to deal with climate change in the way that I think about the role of information. And where I think we may be too late, where I think there are maybe only 2, maybe 3 countries or power bases that can still outdo big tech. We've got the EU, the online safety bill in the UK, because it will guide so much global movement, and the US. But other than that, I don't think there's a country on earth that's more powerful than Facebook and Google now.
Chloe asks, what would an internet run for the public good look like, Kyle? How might we create it?
So I think we can, this is where I think there's a teensy bit of hope. And
Good. Always good.
we don't want to leave people just like, well, I'm done. An internet run for the public good would look like a public utility, right? So we would say digital inclusion is now a basic human right. You are entitled to inclusion online as a citizen in the same way that you're entitled to health, housing, speech, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So, okay, great. Now there are some huge companies that have done really well creating this stuff. We're not going to be able to create something that competes because of the network effect. Everyone's already there. So instead, we're going to say, you're a public utility. We're okay with you being a monopoly, but being a monopoly means and setting all the rules. And that means who's entitled to an account and on what basis. What does an appeal look like? How does fact-checking work? Who is a fact-checker? And at what point does something need to be fact-checked? All of those criteria, and then these companies can be audited against them. So a lot of people, the narrative we're going to hear around regulating big tech is, well, they're the last bastion of free speech, here, there, everywhere. I'm sorry. In a democratic society, the last bastion of free speech should be my democratically elected government that is instituting laws and norms and regulations that we have empowered them to institute. If we're saying that we'd prefer Facebook decide who has speech as opposed to rules that we've set, then that to me is far less democratic and far less enabling of speech. Because the company is basically at its behest to decide who has an account, who doesn't, who gets banned, who doesn't, with no right to appeal, no right to recourse. So I think the way to get these tech companies and platforms to acting more in the public interest is to simply treat them like public utilities. I think the breaking them up, besides the logical breakups, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp should be 3 separate companies. But the idea of breaking up Facebook to me just diffuses the problem.
It's more practical to accept it as a monopoly will stay that way.
Yeah. Same way that, we have a water utility and others,
There's something in the book I really liked as well on the points we were discussing earlier about this warped reality that's being created. You had this idea about algorithms that you could choose you could opt into different algorithms. So on the days where you want to be a bit more challenged, you could have different stories on your newsfeed. On days when you want to feel confirmed, you could have your sort of information silo. But that was an interesting concept, I thought.
Yeah, and
algorithms don't have to be used in the way that they currently are being.
Yeah, so the first thing to remember is algorithms are built by people and trained by watching users. So an algorithm is going to reflect society. If society is racist, an algorithm is going to be racist, right? I mean, and we see this in Twitter introduced a bot account built on an algorithm to learn, and it was going to become what Twitter was. And it was like within 6 hours, it was like a racist Nazi, because that's what it was listening to on social media to drive something, right? So we design these things, which means we can tweak them. Right now, we have no idea what these algorithms are optimizing for. And so Sir Tim Berners-Lee has said, we can decide certain criteria for optimization within an algorithm that is dictated to a company and audited annually, biannually. Another idea is a universality aspect, meaning that regardless of who you are and how you engage on social media, 50% of everything you see would be universal to everyone. And I think it's important that we get away from the idea that each social media account is for the user, and instead see the social media ecosystem as for society and find ways to optimize that for society.
Yeah,
that doesn't
landscape we're all operating in.
Yeah, that doesn't mean you can't share, read, whatever you want. It simply means that maybe we should have a certain amount of stuff that everybody sees.
And I think that was a question that Fraser had. He was asking about how to weed out truth from disinformation and maybe algorithms being tuned to find the difference.
Yeah, and just can I say one quick thing just about truth and disinformation? The other thing we know about disinformation, and this was solidified very recently by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, who did a study of COVID disinformation, is that there are super spreaders, just like a virus. And I explain disinformation through that lens in the book as well. But we learned recently, and Facebook did not refute this, that just 12 accounts are responsible for 65% of COVID disinformation on Facebook. 12 accounts. Yeah. So if you don't even need to deplatform these people. You simply need to disable engagement. Just don't let people like, share, or comment on the stuff that we know isn't true. And you can greatly impact the problem. Your uncle who thinks the earth is flat and has 12 Facebook friends is not the problem, right? The problem is people who are monetizing anti-vax information.
It. So, another question from Atrin. Under data protection law, can we ask big tech companies for all the data they have on us?
Yes. So you can, on any social media company, on any social media platform, you can ask for your entire data package, everything about you in it, and they have to provide it.
Great.
Short answer.
Very good to know. Really good to know, yeah.
And you can also request that they delete everything about you if you decide to leave a platform. But doing that personal audit will be, it will shock people. And I think that's something just to prepare people for. You will be amazed at what these companies have on you. So just as an example, if you've ever installed the Facebook app on your phone and you've given it access to your contacts so it can show you who else might be friends from your phone, they now have every phone number of all your friends that are in your phone.
And so just on a really practical basis, how do people do this? What do they have to do? Send email requests, letters, what?
So you go right into your profile, security and privacy settings, and it will be in there. And you can even search on DuckDuckGo. Don't Google it. DuckDuckGo it. How do I download all the data Facebook has on me? And you'll get an instant 3 steps screenshot.
Great. Dave is asking, what was the turning point that threw us off the track of the idealized web of Bush and Tim Berners-Lee, and onto this commercialized track? Where did that difference go from it being something that was seen like a really positive resource for everyone, and now it's veered off into this direction? What happened?
I would argue that it was always a myth that it was a democratic space. I would say that there was a very brief moment where it was, until maybe 2004, 2005, when it was extremely diffused and extremely destination driven. Like, you would go on to read your friend's blog spot, or you would go on to read a particular news article on a news website. But the power of the internet is in the network effect. So by design, it was destined to be monopolies. It's simply that, a search engine is better the more times people search. So it simply becomes better. Where we went wrong was not intervening earlier and acknowledging that these are actually future public utilities. And I can't think of particular writers now, but you can go back and read in 04, 5, 6, a few people who were called cranks, this is all the rest of it, who were like, this is the moment to say, search should be a public entity. Because, Google search is a great example. 91% of all searches in the UK are done on Google. 91%. And more than 3/4 of all engagements on the internet start with search. So 3/4 of the time, 91% of users are using Google to start their internet journey. That means whatever Google search delivers is dictating knowledge. It's dictating the internet. And less than 1 in 10 people go to the second page of results. That is an obscene amount of power. And we see how it works when you want to silence stuff, because Google used to operate in China, and if you searched for Tiananmen Square, you'd get 0 results. And you talk about 1984, we talk about Big Brother, all the rest, Brave New World. We're there. This is it. One company deciding what you see when you search for anything on their homepage is dictating reality.
Sally asks, the chapter on assessing your digital life, if you make the changes that you advocate, how many people would it take for a tipping point to be reached, for a real movement to make social media companies actually have to do something about this? Enough people coming off Facebook? I mean, there's a lot of talk at the moment of people deactivating their accounts or not as many people are using it. You know, it's gone down in the recent years. But would this ever get to a critical mass?
So the first thing I'd say is, you know, I talk a lot about the societal impacts, but how this affects you. What was the person's name? Sorry.
Sally, I think.
Sally. How this affects you, Sally, is just as important. So if you want to do this for yourself and get off this space, regardless of the societal impact, go for it. Give it a try, because the first thing you become is then an advocate for it, right? And I suggest a 30-day challenge with one platform to start with. Just do 30 days of no X and see if you can live without it. I'm pretty sure by the end of the 30 days, you won't feel like you want or need it. Now, on the societal level, we fortunately have an example. So recently, and it was roughly 20 million is what it took. So WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, was changing its terms and conditions to make it far more invasive of your data, your information, combining data and information. It led to a huge upswell in people leaving, primarily for another messaging app called Signal, which is it is basically blockchain. I mean, it's sort of owned by nobody and everybody. And it hit 21 million people, and Facebook announced they were delaying the change. After the delay, you don't have to accept it to continue using WhatsApp. So there are points at which you can impact change. This is where I see the role of government being incredibly important. It isn't up to all of us to solve the social media crisis, because if you think about it, like, we've empowered governments to look after us. This is system change. And I think it's an important point, because oftentimes the same thing has happened with climate change, right? We've been told for 10 years if we stop using plastic straws, we're going to save the planet. Come on. 100 companies produce 71% of all greenhouse gas emissions, right? So in the same way that we greenwash, we tech wash.
Yeah.
And we say, if you change your behavior, you can change the internet. No. Like, this is systemic change that needs to be led by democratic governments. And so that's why I advocate for pushing our governments to intervene on our behalf at scale. I mean, we even looked at, would it be possible, as an example, after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, would it be possible for the Information Commissioner's Office, the data regulator in the UK, to intervene on behalf of all people harmed? Unfortunately, the law doesn't work like that in the UK, so you can't get to scale. But if you can impact their bottom line, and governments have the power to do this, if you can impact their bottom line, you'll drive market change.
Matthew asks, following on from that, is Signal any better than WhatsApp in terms of privacy? Is it? If so, how?
Absolutely, 100%. There is not a single thing that you put on Signal that would make your individual device identifiable. You can put any phone number into it, and you can link it to any profile name. And it does not store anything. It's end-to-end encrypted. It doesn't back up. You can set disappearing messages, so things are not kept or recorded. And you can have the confidence that there is no server at some mystical place secretly storing or reading everything. And I say that sort of but as an example, Gmail used to say it was end-to-end encrypted, but it was encrypted at your device. It would go to a server. It would be unencrypted to determine who it needed to go to, and then it would be re-encrypted. So there's still a moment when it's not encrypted. Signal is properly end-to-end encrypted.
Stephen Kinsella asks, do you have any sense what percentage of social media accounts are bots or fake accounts? Why do advertisers tolerate paying for non-existent eyeballs?
Users.
What's in it for them?
First, hi, Stephen. Thanks for joining. So what we know is we only get, this is another great priming question for a really important fact about social media. The only information we get about what's happening on the platforms is from the platforms. So for example, Facebook says we deleted 2 billion fake accounts last year. Of how many? You know, how many did you miss? What's your ratio? And they'll never present that information. So they say, oh, 2 billion people saw reputable COVID vaccine information. How many people saw COVID disinformation? Oh, we don't have that data. Of course you don't, you know? So the best guesstimates are that anywhere from 15 to 35% of accounts could be bots. Now, I think in terms of that should definitely worry advertisers. But of course, what bots usually aren't doing is scrolling. So it's not necessarily costing the advertiser a ton of money, and it's probably being pitched to the advertiser that way as well. But I think you need to first be able to know how to recognize a bot, and I talk about the ways that you can do that. Does it have a profile picture? Is it, you know, following tons of people but has no followers? Are there lots of errors in the typing language? But there are lots of great proposals as well around where anonymity should be allowed and where it shouldn't. And I think that that's the next stage of this conversation, is about saying, okay, you can be anonymous until you want to X, engage, comment, like, share. The balancing act is going to be in how we verify someone as a user. Do we want to, do we want to allow the tech companies to decide who can be a user and who can't? Do we want an independent body? On what basis? What information are they storing on you to allow you to have an account? How does that come back to you in terms of privacy? Does that give them permission to look at everything you post? Like, these are all the details that we need to get into. But ultimately, for me, it's about saying a company should not be deciding how our digital public sphere works. It should be left to regulators and democratically accountable regulators and governments.
Tom asks if there are any plans for you to translate this book.
That's a great question. Yes, I mean the plan is, thanks to the incredible readership and generosity of people who have supported the book. The first edition is less than 100 copies left. So Byline Books has just ordered a second edition run. And the goal from that edition is to, move into foreign language and also move into other markets, other countries. With another edition, my hope is to, by early next year, have added all of the stuff that's happened since this one was written, so it will be even more up to date. But there's also going to be an ebook available in the next week or two, and so if you have an ebook translation tool on your ebook device, then you should be able to get, unfortunately, a rough translation. But
fantastic that it's going out into other
absolutely.
countries. That's what we need, more people reading the book.
Well, and I think, I was just going to say, I mean, the reason I wanted to make it a book, even though it's small and on the shorter side, is
little black book.
The little black book fits in your pocket, and there's nothing on the binding because it's a little black book, is because I think the subject requires the seriousness of a book as opposed to an article or a blog post, but the accessibility of an article or a blog post. So that's sort of how it ended up as a little black book.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's just, it makes one reflect. And there's something about turning pages and absorbing something, I think. An easy question. Sarah asks, how do we buy this book? littleblackdatabook.com. littleblackdatabook.com, and that will take you to the Byline Books sales site. Great. I think we're coming up to our last few questions. Anist asks, would public utility regulation engage with deep and dark web, or just touch the surface?
Excellent question. One that I have not deeply considered. So thank you for the question, because now I'm going to deeply consider it. Though I will say the estimate is that only 30% of the internet is actually above the line.
Yes.
And that's 70%, so a majority of the internet is what's called the dark web.
Yeah.
It's
Gosh.
Yeah, in the same way that we use a small percentage of our brains, the collective brain of the internet is also just barely above the surface.
I feel like that's another book entirely,
God.
Kyle. It's going to be another Q&A
Little black
session.
book of the dark web.
And finally, James asks, do you ever think an internet truly empowering Joe Blogs will ever get beyond control of the powerful?
No.
Oh, Kyle.
I think that see what I want to see is an internet that is 50% universal in terms of like what is a digital society, and 50% for you. And I want part of it to not be driven by money, but instead by information and access and democracy, and leave a portion of it to be for profit, to fund the rest of it. But why are we not seeing this monolithic industry that is making tens, hundreds of billions of pounds in profit a year as a vehicle to fund the internet we want to see? Great, you can have this portion of it, but in exchange for that, we get this portion of it. And I think that it's a really good question, the idea of Joe Blogs, because it comes back to something that I was thinking about at the beginning as well, about the rewiring of actually how we think. And the idea, it's because everything is for profit, Joe Blogs has to think about building an audience to monetize. And that is changing the way Joe Blogs expresses themselves, right? We don't think of an idea, expressing an idea and then express it. We think, how can I express this idea on Twitter in a way that it will be beloved? It will get likes, shares, comments. And so for Joe Blogs to be able to actually emerge writing stuff that is what Joe Blogs believes in, we need to find a way in which he's not just trying to do it to make money.
It's a very thought-provoking point to end on. Sarah says, thank you for the link, because she has ordered the copy.
Thanks, Sarah.
So that's good. Well, I think that's about it from our questions this evening, Kyle.
Ooh,
thank you.
That flew by.
Well, thank you so much for taking
Pleasure.
the time to discuss this book with me and for answering these questions. It is a really great piece of work. Thank you for writing it, and on Byline Books as well. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks to Byline Books for publishing it, and for all the readers who read it.
Yeah.
Pass it on. Educate people.
That's the way. But thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, Kyle.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us for this first Byline Book Club. I hope it's given you plenty of food for thought. It's mostly quite scary, but I think there are some real practical things as well that we can all do on an individual level, and plenty to think through there from Kyle. So thanks very much for watching. As Kyle said, this book is available from the website, Little Black Data Book. littleblackdatabook.com. You can also find more information around these topics and articles, of course, on the Byline Times website. Subscribe to our monthly print edition. And of course, thank you for all of your continued support for Byline TV as well. I'll be back on Friday night with Peter Jukes for Friday Night with Byline Times, our regular show where we discuss issues much to do with disinformation and the internet and all sorts. So if you like tonight, you might like Friday night as well. But for now, thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.